people of faith and all people really should be talking about. So we are so grateful to have been asked to host the last of these events throughout Wisconsin. And we welcome you, Reverend Butler. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for all of the sponsors who helped to sponsor this event. You'll see in your program a list of those sponsors. For those of you who are here in person with us, after this, please join us in our fellowship hall over here, or in our gathering space, for some light refreshments. And Reverend Butler will also be selling and signing some of her books. And so stay for some fellowship time with us, please. For those of you who are online, we have enabled the chat, so we do invite you to chat. If there is something that comes up during this, go ahead and have that conversation with one another. And I'm going to try my best to also monitor the chat here, because I know there will be a Q&A, and so I'll do my best to get those questions to you, Rabbi Bonnie. So, Rabbi Bonnie, you're going to do some introductions. I invite you.
Yeah. I don't have my mic. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on this rather chilly night, although it's been worse. So we're so excited to have Reverend Butler here for these last 3 days. This Faith and Democracy Tour is brought to you by a group of faith-based organizations that have been working together for almost 2 years now on what we call Creating Beloved Community. It's Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, Wisconsin Council of Churches, Wisdom, Micah, the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, the Wisconsin Council of Rabbis, and the Jewish Community Relations Council. And we've been having conversations about what is our role and responsibility as faith-based organizations to counter white Christian nationalism and systemic racism. And from those conversations, a number of different programs and projects have emerged. One is called Taking a Faithful Stance for Equity. And there are flyers out on the literature table that tell you more about that and how to get involved with that initiative. And basically, we have a pledge on the Wisconsin Council of Churches website that we ask you to take that says, I'm going to pay attention to what's going on in my local school boards or my common council or in my area, or particularly on issues around equity. And when I see something happening, I'm going to go to my school board meeting or my common council meeting. I'm going to testify. I'm going to bring a friend with me. I'm going to make my friend testify. And then I'm going to let the organizers, our different organizations, know that this is happening so we can reach out to folks in your region and say, did you know this thing is happening? You need to go out to that meeting and you need to raise your voice. So that's Taking a Faithful Stance for Equity. We have a mailing list. We have monthly webinars where we have statewide speakers speaking about a wide variety of issues. We've had somebody come and talk about critical race theory and what it is and what it isn't. We have done a 501c3 do's and don'ts around the election. So what we can do as faith communities without violating our church or synagogue or mosque's nonprofit status. We've had somebody from the Wisconsin School Board Association come and talk about what is it that our school boards do and what do our school board members do and what are the kinds of decisions do they make that affects our kids and their schooling and what they learn in school or what they don't learn in school. So a wide variety of different kinds of topics and an opportunity for people also to gather in breakout rooms and do their own local sort of on-the-ground organizing and meeting each other. We also have a project called Teach the Truth Wisconsin, the second week of October. That Monday is always Indigenous Peoples Day, and October 14th is George Floyd's birthday. And we ask you to find a place in your locality that has some kind of racial history, whether it be something around slavery or the Underground Railroad or the Civil Rights Movement or something around Indigenous rights or something around LGBTQ rights, and make a video, do something creative, do a pop-up lecture, do a walking tour, do a creative dance, do a rap song, do something, and film it and send us the video, and we put it up online on the Teach the Truth Wisconsin webpage. So you can see last year's events and the events from the year before last and give you some inspiration for our upcoming Teach the Truth next October. And we've connected with some national organizations that do similar kinds of work, one of which is Faith in Public Life. And people ask me, well, what does Faith in Public Life do? And I like to tell them, well, what Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice does here in Wisconsin, Faith in Public Life does nationally. So they organize in an interfaith way clergy and congregations of all different faiths around the country to come together for issues of justice and democracy. And when we heard that Reverend Butler had written this book, Who Stole My Bible? The Rise of White Christian Nationalism, and that she was launching a Faith and Democracy tour. And actually, by a weird coincidence, I got the email in my email, and like 5 minutes later, Tim emailed me and said, have you seen this? And my husband emailed me and said, have you seen this? And I said, okay, there's a convergence here. So I brought it to our Creating Beloved community team, and we all said, absolutely, we've got to bring Reverend Butler here. Reverend Butler is the founder of Faith in Public Life. She is now the founder in residence, and she has done just amazing work throughout her career. She's been working with the UN on issues of global equity. She has been a Peace Corps volunteer, and since 2005, she was the CEO of Faith in Public Life, and just stepped down last year so that she could focus on writing and speaking. And we're so glad that she has done that, because now we get to have her here. So I'm going to stop talking and let her do all the talking now. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I got a mic on, so it'll be all right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rabbi Bonnie, for that great introduction. And thank you, Wisconsin. Wow, I mean, 19 groups have come together to sponsor this Faith and Democracy tour here. And as Rabbi Bonnie was saying, they're organizing together. The past 2 years in particular, there's been just this real uptick in convergence, and it really gives me a lot of hope to see what's happening here, and I'm learning so much from all of you. So it is an honor to be here. And like she said, I do hope you join one of these groups, because we can't be alone in these times, and it'll give you so much courage and so much hope. Throughout my career, I have had countless interactions like the one that I'm about to tell you, and they never surprise me, because in recent years, the perspectives of one wing of Christianity have come to dominate American public life. It was last May, Supreme Court Justice Alito's opinion on Dobbs, the case that would overturn Roe v. Wade, had just been leaked. And I was heading to meet up with a group of faith leaders on Capitol Hill to march in support of reproductive health care. Dressed in my clerical collar and wearing a cross, I dashed into a museum to grab a bottle of water. "What brings you to town?" the cashier asked. She was a woman about my age. "I'm here for the Dobbs decision. There's a rally out on the National Mall," I said. Her eyes took in my collar and took in my words. And I prepared for the worst as she leaned toward me with the plexiglass between us to whisper to me, "I'm Catholic and I'm pro-life, but I'm terrified about what this decision will mean for women," as her eyes welled with tears. She asked if I would pray for her and for all women. And so right there in the shop, surrounded by tourists and souvenirs, we bowed our heads and prayed for the sake of the world's women. I share that story because it illustrates where many of us have found ourselves in recent decades. Wherever we stand on the issues, we can see that religion has been increasingly playing a polarizing role in public debates, and we can't come together around unifying and practical solutions to the issues that we face. This polarization, which began in the late 70s with the advent of the Christian right, has been compounding, and it has brought us to a point where elements of the Christian right have joined together to create a full-blown Christian nationalist movement that threatens to dismantle our democracy. Christian nationalism's goal is to grab power, control, and wealth. And it has caused a crisis of faith. It's turning people away from the sacred faith in droves. An increasing number of Christians are totally turned off and unable to find a spiritual home because of what they've seen in religion and because they've been outright harmed at times by it. The ranks of the religious nuns, those who say that they're atheist or agnostic, humanist, or something in between, have swelled to 30% of the US population, and among them are many of our young people. And my heart goes out to them because I was once one of them. I almost left the church in the middle of seminary, no less. Sexism and anti-LGBTQ fervor in the church in the 90s made me question my sense of call. Then one day I was organizing interfaith leaders to speak about the religious foundations for women's rights at a UN conference. We had opted to give our event space over to Muslim women who were experiencing extremism in Afghanistan and Iran. And the place was packed to the gills. There was standing room only. And midway through the women's presentation, there was a big commotion at the door. And I looked over, and three huge men with security wires in their ears were trying to get in the doorway, and they were surrounding a person that was clearly the ambassador of one of the countries one of these women was from. The speaker froze, and her face went pale. And then suddenly, all the people in the room rose to their feet and began to applaud the women on the panel. This had the effect of shutting the security guards and the ambassador out of the room. They left in disgust, and the woman was able to smile, catch her breath, and begin to speak again. That incident and the courage of those Muslim women helped me realize that I needed to reclaim my faith as they had done for the sake of the world's women and for justice. I could not allow religious nationalists in my own country to hijack my faith. Just as they had, I needed to have the courage to stand firm and to continue to speak out. A few years later, I founded Faith in Public Life to bring moderate and progressive American faith leaders to the forefront of American public debates. I had come of age in an era when the Christian right dominated the media, and now I was tackling their divisiveness head-on with the voices of faith. Except in my early work, my colleagues were often reticent to ground their press remarks in religious belief and in scripture, thinking that church-state separation required that they keep their religious viewpoints private. They were mistaken, because the First Amendment focuses on preventing government from establishing religion and from privileging one religion over other religions, but it does not bar religious voices from the public square. The result of our muting and quieting our own voice was that the Christian right was heard on a daily basis, while our religious perspective went virtually unheard. I came of age in the 80s with Jerry Falwell on the nightly news, and I never once saw a progressive faith voice on the news. For many, Christian right came to represent the entire Christian landscape. The solution is to amplify our voice and vision so as to diversify and add nuance to public debates. I've stood shoulder to shoulder with people of many faiths and moral perspectives on the issues we face today, to model respect for pluralism even as we make a faith-based argument from our own specific religious traditions. The First Amendment protects our right to do so, and building a pluralistic democracy demands that we model pluralism in speaking out from our faith traditions. For example, when the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops opposed the Affordable Care Act, falsely claiming that it would fund and increase abortions, Faith in Public Life worked with Catholic sisters and priests and healthcare agencies around the country to make a Catholic argument for healthcare reform. And when North Carolina wanted to require that immigrants carry a pink ID card, we worked with Jewish leaders to push back by speaking out about the history of gold stars and Nazi persecution. When Occupy Wall Street drew attention to greedy investors who crashed the economy through risky mortgages, we marched with a golden calf to Wall Street to draw attention to the idolatry of the love of money. And when Congress threatened to cut food stamps, we called that what it was, a sin. These stark, simple, moral messages made the rounds in many news outlets and continue to do so even to this day. Although we made headway with these actions, progressive people of faith are still paying the price for decades of muting their voice. Harder line elements in the Christian right have now seized the upper hand, evolving into full-blown Christian nationalist movement. According to scholars Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, about 20% of Americans are fully bought into Christian nationalism. Another 32% are accommodating toward Christian nationalism. Politicians and donors are pandering to Christian nationalists who increasingly overlap with other anti-democratic groups like QAnon and militias. A 2013 Supreme Court decision gutted the Voting Rights Act and opened up the floodgates for hundreds of voter suppression laws and redistricting measures across the country targeting communities of color with surgical precision. All of this reached a climax on January 6, 2021, when Christian nationalists and violent extremists rallied their adherents for an invasion of the US Capitol. A report by Christians Against Christian Nationalism, a campaign led by the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Freedom and Belief, describes the Christian flags that flew over the Capitol on that horrifying day, including one called an appeal to heaven. The phrase appeal to heaven is a quote from the philosopher John Locke, taken to convey God's blessing on armed revolution against government. And it was designed during the American Revolution against Britain and associated with George Washington. This flag, which shows a pine tree on a white background, continues to show up at the US Capitol, even in the wake of the insurrection. Again, it signifies today white Christian nationalism. And the US representative from Wisconsin, Glenn Grothman, recently placed this flag in front of his door. It's really important to understand what Christian nationalism is. When I say Christian nationalism, I'm not talking about Christians who feel patriotic. I'm not even talking about a religious movement. I'm talking about a political ideology that uses the language of faith to justify greed, power, and control over those less powerful groups. It seeks to advance the power of its particular ethnic group and install a theocratic, autocratic government. And it has become a tool of control wielded by power-hungry politicians who have cozied up to such voices for mutual gain. Christian nationalism foundation, its foundation is rooted in centuries of anti-Semitism. It perpetuates the lie that a cabal of elite Jews seeks to overthrow the government and is mobilizing Black and brown people to replace white people. The origins of this conspiracy theory go back centuries to the Middle Ages, but more recently in 19th century Russia, it was used by the Tsar to scapegoat Jews when his power was threatened. And then it was perpetuated in the United States by industrialist Henry Ford, among others, and it was taken to its darkest manifestation in Nazi Germany. It continues today. We saw it at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville with the chant, "Jews will not replace us." It's working its way through our nation's DNA in dangerous ways. Replacement theory, as it's called, motivated a man to massacre people, mostly Black, while grocery shopping in Buffalo. Replacement theory led a young white supremacist to slaughter the Black Bible study members at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. We saw it again in the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh that killed 11 and wounded 6, and in the killing of 7 and wounding of 48 at a 4th of July parade in a primarily Jewish suburb of Chicago. The list of recent hate crimes, unfortunately, is much longer than what I've named, but those are some examples. White Christian nationalism is a growing threat that is often with us in really quiet ways that we fail to notice until it becomes overtly violent. For decades, people of faith have been pushing back on these quieter manifestations of Christian nationalism, which are deeply rooted in our history. Since we're meeting in a Baptist church right now, I thought it was important to mention one example of when Baptists and Jews together pushed back on one of Christian nationalism's more subtle manifestations. In the 1990s, conservatives and liberals united to pass the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. People call it RFRA for short. This sought to clarify and strengthen the Constitution's First Amendment, which calls for the free exercise of religion. Baptists, grounded in their history of persecution as religious minorities during the American colonies, played a leadership role in drafting this historic legislation. In 2014, I found myself, though, calling Baptist pastors in my home state of Georgia to warn them of a different Religious Freedom Act. A state RFRA was moving through the legislature, and it appeared to be innocent, but it actually removed the key legal language that protected minority groups from discrimination in housing, in healthcare, and in jobs, and it targeted LGBTQ people. At its core, the state RFRA said that entities could discriminate in the name of their faith. Jews and Christians united to expose the true intent of that bill and defeat it. The Christian right kept trying to claim that Christians supported the bill, but Baptists, even those not supportive of marriage equality, showed up at the Capitol to say these bills were not about religious freedom and that discrimination was immoral. My favorite headline was, "Dueling Baptists Debate Religious Freedom at the Capitol." And to this day, I imagine Baptist pastors like sword fighting with little musketeer hats when I remember that headline. Despite the successful protests, the Georgia RFRA at one point made it through the state legislature and put the Republican governor in a difficult spot. It was the governor's Baptist pastor, supported by our staff and legal experts, who helped the governor in his decision-making. The governor referenced the long-standing Baptist tradition of protecting religious minorities when he said, "I do not think we have to discriminate against anyone to protect the faith-based community in Georgia, of which I and my family have been a part for all of our lives. That is the character of Georgia, and I intend to do my part to keep it that way." He vetoed the bill because of his faith, not despite it. Using the guise of religious freedom to exclude minority groups has a really long history. Today's version of white Christian nationalism was born 5 decades ago, when the moral majority and the Christian right groups were founded. But the origin story of these groups is not exactly what you might think it is. Many think it was the passage of Roe v. Wade that galvanized the Christian right, but it was not. It was outrage over desegregation. When the Christian right lost its ability to use the First Amendment's Religious Freedom Clause to justify discrimination, it needed to find a new boogeyman, and that became abortion. 1 year before Roe, in 1972, the US Supreme Court ruled that segregation academies, private schools that barred Black students, could no longer enjoy tax-exempt status as other nonprofits do. Bob Jones University, a Christian segregation academy in Greenville, South Carolina, was one of the first to be fined by the IRS and actually lose its IRS tax exemption, and was fined like $500,000. The university filed an injunction to prevent this, but the US Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, ruled against their right to discriminate. Upon hearing this ruling, Bob Jones III lamented that America was doomed. "Our nation," he said, "from this day forward is no better than Russia insofar as expecting the blessings of God is concerned. You no longer live in a nation that is religiously free. In other words, Jones believed that racism was core to his faith, and he believed that he had a religious right to segregate. Without this right, he said, God would damn America. There's perhaps no better example of the conflation of racist white Christian beliefs and national identity than that statement right there. What Bob Jones was mourning was the death of decades of using Christian private schools to resegregate society, even as the courts sought to desegregate. Throughout the civil rights movement, Southern legislatures had enacted as many as 450 laws and resolutions to evade desegregation, chief among them voucher programs, that essentially siphoned off public funding from public schools into private schools. The fights over vouchers spread well beyond the South, and they live on today. The language of school choice sounds innocent and positive, but once we put it in its historical white Christian nationalist context and analyze the winners and the losers, the intent of it becomes clear. Wealthy white kids win, poor white kids and kids of color lose, and the next generation is raised to hold on to power, control, and wealth. The battle over school choice and vouchers was front and center in your last gubernatorial election. Today, the exact same percentage of Milwaukee's black school children attend hyper-segregated schools, as was the case in the 1960s. In the 60s and 70s, schools were desegregated thanks to the court orders and initiatives like busing. But with the emergence of the Christian right, this trend reversed. And today, Milwaukee not only leads the nation in black children attending hyper-segregated schools, but it also posts among the highest rates of black children attending what one scientist called apartheid schools, schools in which 99% of the students are minorities. I only recently learned that I was in the first wave of Atlanta school children to go to a desegregated school. In 1973, Jimmy Carter was elected governor of Georgia on the heels of a self-proclaimed notorious white supremacist named Lester Maddox. Some of y'all remember him, look at that. A restaurateur who refused to desegregate his establishment on religious freedom grounds. In fact, it was black seminary students who tried to go into his restaurant, and he refused them. Carter was a devout Baptist who opposed segregation, and he chose to use busing to integrate schools. In love with my integrated public school and taught entirely by black women, I was oblivious to the fact that close friends and family members removed their children and placed them in private schools to evade desegregation. Sure, I heard murmurs and I saw racism in the glances of neighbors when I brought black friends home, but I had no context to understand the struggle that I was a part of. Then in junior high, my family moved me to a private school, what I now know was a white segregation academy. I hated it and felt demoralized by the experience, which was insular, clannish, and stifling. By mapping my own history onto my own state history has helped me to understand fully that history is not progressive, as many of us were taught. We don't always just get better because we're getting more modern and we're improving every day. Each generation has to fight to keep moving toward God's vision of dignity and human flourishing. That's why we have to look at our failures and our triumphs, and we should never keep our children from our full history. Which could bring me to a whole lot of issue areas, but one in particular is critical race theory. CRT is now being used to scare parents, to be clear, white parents. All this theory says is that our history and policy should be examined with the awareness that racism is systemic in American society. It's about telling the truth in our history so that we can learn how to create a more just world. The tradition of revisionism must be countered. Early in our nation's history, missionaries created a slave Bible. that removed Exodus because slaves revolted after hearing the story that God freed slaves. After the Civil War, generations grew up on Southern propaganda that went so far as to suggest that slavery was benevolent and Black people were better off under that system. Southerners wrote textbooks that taught that the Civil War was not about slavery at all. They made themselves out to be victims of Northern aggression in the war and called the war the lost cause as though it defended something noble. Revisionism prevented generations of white Southerners from correcting the sins of their forefathers. And for me, it gets personal. White children like me who grew up in the South had to leave home to find out about American history. Today, Florida is one of dozens of states that have passed laws restricting what can be taught in elementary through college levels. Florida is censoring books, firing superintendents, and closely monitoring history teachers. Teachers are unsure of what can be taught since the law has no clearly defined parameters, and it's having a chilling effect. Recently, the College Board even watered down a Black History AP course in response to Florida Governor DeSantis's criticism. And a similar effort involving censorship is moving forward this year in Wisconsin. You'll be hearing more about that later on. Preventing young people from learning their full history is a political ploy, and it is also a spiritual crisis. Only when we remember our community story can we live into the abundance God offers and calls us to work for. In every era, faithful people have risen up to challenge Christian nationalism by reclaiming the traditions of human dignity, justice, and freedom. For centuries, slaveholders made biblical arguments to justify slavery, and yes, they got away with it until formerly enslaved people like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, as well as white abolitionists, reclaimed scripture to abolish slavery. The KKK burned crosses on lawns to terrorize Black citizens and prevent them from organizing. To face down the white Christian nationalism of that era, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King stood alongside rabbis and ministers, priests, and people of moral courage to make the case that we could not call ourselves Christian, nor could we call ourselves a democracy without ensuring the dignity of all. A few years ago, when former Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced his plans to take immigrant children from their families, we gave Sessions a Bible lesson he would never forget. When religious leaders across the board condemned his horrific policy, Sessions was livid, and he chose to deliver a damning rebuke of the faith community. He stood before a gathering of law enforcement officials, and he read Romans 13, verse 1 to 7, which says that Christians need to obey the laws of government because God has ordained the laws for the purpose of order. That very same passage was used by slaveholders attempting to silence abolitionists. The rebuke from religious communities was swift, and it made every headline in the nation. Sessions got himself a thumping. Clergy explained to Sessions that the short passage occurs in the middle of a treatise on love, and it concludes that love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore that love is the fulfillment of law. Not to mention that Paul, who wrote those words, spent a lot of time in prison for defying the local authorities and governments. Our public theological debate with the Attorney General shows how our moral and theological resources can and should play a role in preserving our democracy, how we can make a persuasive case against violent and unjust policies, and how we can prevent people from getting pulled deeper into the heresy of Christian nationalism. It's our turn now to organize in our era to do what Sojourner Truth and Martin Luther King did, organize and amplify our diverse faith voices in the public square, arguing for democracy as that system that protects the human dignity of all people. Last August, I saw an example of what this can look like in the small town of Batavia, New York, outside Rochester. The Reawaken America tour, which is headlined by the disgraced General and former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, was being hosted at a local church. Speakers spouted misinformation, conspiracy theories, and violent Christian nationalist rhetoric to a very eager audience. But theirs was not the only voice that was heard on that day. Faith leaders from that small rural town mounted a vigorous response, holding a well-covered press conference and using their moral power and voice to counter the hateful rhetoric spewing from the Christian nationalists across the street. In the same way, you've seen the collective moral power to preserve democracy right here in Wisconsin. Last November, faith leaders in Wisconsin and all over the nation served as peacekeepers at polling places. And here in Wisconsin, you all are connecting across faith and religion, examining your own history and policies, and organizing to uplift dignity and democracy. You are not alone, nor should you be alone in this moment. In a few minutes, you're going to hear about another opportunity to engage with an active coalition of multi-faith leaders to put this vision into action. So I invite you to sign up on my email list to stay connected with the work I'm doing at Faith in Public Life and the writing that I'm doing and the work we're doing to protect our democracy. You walk in the footsteps of heroes who defied tyranny against all odds and prevailed. When you feel too small or overwhelmed, picture the abolitionists of the 18th century who dared to defy the slave trade. Picture the civil rights leaders of the 20th century who laid groundwork to defy Jim Crow segregation. Around each of these heroes we know were thousands of untold stories and heroes whose actions, big and small, tilted that arc of the universe toward justice. It's why I wrote Who Stole My Bible? Our sacred texts also offer us heroes and strategies to take on the emperors and pharaohs and Goliaths of our day in that quest for the beloved community. Know that God has called each of you for such a time as this and has given you unique gifts and distinctive voices for this moment, and that God will bless and magnify your efforts and bring you great joy as you stay rooted in your values and struggle in solidarity with others. We don't know if we will reach the beloved community in our lifetime, but we do know that the wheel of history turns, and it's up to each one of us as to what direction it turns in. Thank you.
So I want to ask Rabbi Betsy Forrester and Reverend Tim Schaefer to join us up here. So we have a interfaith panel to respond to Reverend Butler's presentation and to maybe have some discussion among ourselves. And also, I hope that you all picked up some blank index cards when you walked in, and if you would write down any questions that you have for Reverend Butler or for our panel. We'll see, maybe Peter will collect them as people pass them up toward Peter. Wave. Dr. Peter Bakken from Wisconsin Council of Churches, and Peter will collect questions and pass them up to us as you write them down. And are you, somebody's following people who are putting their questions online? Thank you. Just to introduce our panel, sorry, I have to get my email. Technology, it's an amazing thing. Rabbi Betsy Forrester, my colleague and friend, is a post-denominational rabbi who brings a dynamic and spirited approach to living an observant Jewish life. Her rabbinate centers on practice and text and is animated by passionate compassion. Prior to becoming a rabbi, she was a master teacher and educational leader in the Chicago area for many years. And prior to that, she was a certified speech-language pathologist. Rabbi Betsy came to Madison after being ordained in 2018 and serves as rabbi and sole clergy at Beth Israel Center, a synagogue of approximately 280 households. She's blessed to serve as a faith leader in our community and happy to have returned to her college town after 30 years, and we are very happy to have her among us. Many of you know Reverend Tim Schaefer, who is our host tonight. Tim has served as pastor of First Baptist since November of 2020. Brave man, came right in the middle of the pandemic. Prior to relocating to Wisconsin, he served as minister to youth at Royal Lane Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, where he was ordained in early 2019. Tim holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from Boston University and a Master of Divinity degree, as well as a degree certification in gender and sexual justice from Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University. Tim and his husband, John Duncan, reside in Verona with their 2 rescue dogs. Is it Dolce? Dolce and Makea. And in their free time, they enjoy baking, reading, and traveling together, and I want some baking from you. Okay. Tim has been an amazing force for justice here in Madison. In the 2 years that he's been here, he really hit the ground running, and he's been involved in so many justice areas, and we're really blessed to have you here in our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I had a couple of questions that I wanted to pose, but first I want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to respond to Reverend Butler and to what they heard from her presentation. And we also asked you to give a little bit of thought and maybe share a little bit about what your faith traditions have to say and to teach about our role and responsibility as faith communities in being engaged in the public square and in the civic life and political life of our community. Whoever wants to go first.
All right. Your talk was phenomenal. I just loved it. And it really gave me heart. This notion of creating the beloved community is something that's dear to people of all faiths. I think it certainly is to people of my faith. Some different themes resonated for me. One was what we know about anti-Semitism being at the core of Christian nationalism, and it's having found its way into the DNA of the people of this country. That's frightening for Jews, and while on the one hand we feel very called to participate in the public square to promote the values that we share, good values from the Bible and modern forms of things that are important to us as particularly liberal Jews, which I am. So on the one hand, we're called to raise our voices and to bring these truths out and to make them manifest. And on the other hand, we are always wary of our place, wherever we are. And that's a reality. And we have a history of both activism. I have a face mask that says resisting tyrants since Pharaoh. That is part of Jewish tradition. And we also have a tradition of being careful and praying for the heads of state wherever we live so that they should be well and not hurt us, because we have been very hurt. So these dual realities are very live for us. I think that the values that you spoke of all resonate for the Jewish community. And something else that stood out to me in your talk was the sense that one particular religious narrative has taken over. And I think for Jewish people, we also have this polarization in public discourse. When people want to imagine what an authoritative Jewish voice is, they often go to someone who doesn't look like Bonnie or me, a man with a beard and side locks and a black hat, and who lives a certain way, and that is a certain type of Jew. And there are Jewish communities that have different kinds of opinions, and around some of the issues that are live for us right now, abortion, LGBTQ rights and equality, and others. There are certain voices that are loud and not where Bonnie and I stand and where our liberal colleagues and communities stand. So liberal Judaism is very different from that. And I do think that liberal Jews have a voice in the public square, and that it's a strong voice, and that it has historically been a strong voice. That voice has not always been the voice of Jews per se. It was people who were Jewish and brought these values out into the public. Whereas some of these others who are loud now are very visibly and articulate about being a Jew, representing a Jewish voice. So we have some of that disparity amongst us as well. I think I'll stop there for now.
A lot of what you said, Rabbi, resonates with me, because I think especially when the average person hears the word Baptist, they have an idea of what that means, right? And you referenced this in your talk, and I appreciated this, that the loudest voices are often those of a certain theological perspective. But believe it or not, even among Baptists, there is a range of theologies. And I find it interesting because to say, we almost believe a certain way, and so let's legislate everybody's life, regardless of whether they're even Christian, right, is just not very Baptist, because historically Baptists believed in freedom. There's this notion of soul freedom, that we are free to define our relationship with the divine. And the idea that we have the freedom to interpret scriptures in our own way. That has kind of been lost, I think, over time. I think especially you find among Southern Baptists, they'll have this list of stated beliefs that you must adhere to on websites. And then there are many of us who still honor that historically Baptist tradition. When I'm in that pulpit, I hope I do a good job of reminding folks that this is an interpretation, and often I will bring a different interpretation to the table, through a queer lens, for example. But I always make clear that you don't have to agree. We can actually disagree, and we can have really good conversations about that. And I think that's really important, because most of this legislation in particular that's being passed is about power and control, forcing people to act a certain way. And these religious folks don't even acknowledge that that does not even represent everyone within their own tradition. And that, I think, is the most troubling to me.
Yeah.
So when we organize for Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, and we talk to clergy and invite them to become active in the public sphere, and talk to activists in the pews about being active from your faith, not in spite of your faith, sometimes we get some pushback. And sometimes the pushback is, I don't go to church or to synagogue or to mosque to hear about politics from the pulpit. Sometimes we hear that violates our 501c3, we're going to lose our tax-exempt status. And sometimes we just hear, I do that in my daily life, I don't do that from my religious life. So how do you, because I know both of you are very engaged in being active and vocal and public about your activism from your faith understandings. So how do you work with your congregations to help them connect the dots between my faith teachings and my faith values and what I learn, what I pray, and what I read in church and in mosque and in synagogue, and what I do out in the public square?
Sure. I think it is...
Standing on one foot.
I mean, I think it is entirely appropriate for us to to share, to speak to our faith values and how that affects others, especially the most vulnerable among us. I think it's absolutely appropriate to voice that in the public sphere. I would say to people who have this concern, and I have said this to people who have this concern, that there is a difference between being political and partisan. Yeah. And so we are not partisan, we don't take sides. We talk about the issues. We talk about who is affected. And at least from a Christian perspective, Jesus was political. And really how I interpret that is he was speaking about the concerns of the city. That's ultimately how I define what it means to be political. And I think if we are not political, if we're not addressing how our neighbors are affected by dangerous legislation, for example, or policies, then I think we become irrelevant.
I agree. And I'm not very shy. When one comes to the clergy and fulfills that lifelong dream at the age of 54, which is what I did, one doesn't have time to monkey around. So, last summer, Reverend Miranda Hassett from St. Dunstan's and I addressed this topic in a public conversation, and we brought texts from Fosdick and Heschel. And I had a really enlightening conversation, I felt, in front of my community about this very question. There are pressures on either side. I feel that we will not only be irrelevant if we don't show care and concern and be activist for those cares and concerns of our neighbors and ourselves, but we also won't be true to our faith. I was once, before I became a rabbi, sitting in a congregation doing a Torah study, and we were studying a biblical narrative about what happens when a corpse is found, apparently murdered, between two towns. So the elders of the nearest town have to do a very strange sacrificial ritual right there over the body, next to the body, and say that our hands didn't shed this blood. We really are not at fault here. And of course, they are. They are at fault in some way that such a thing could happen, that a person could pass through their town, not be cared for, not be housed, be so vulnerable, and that kind of violence could be perpetrated by somebody who probably walks among them. This was during a summer in Chicago when every Monday the Chicago Tribune and the Sun-Times showed the dead, the murdered of that weekend. It's still a huge problem. It was a tremendous problem that particular summer. So the rabbi who was teaching gave over this teaching, and I raised my hand and I said, so this is happening 25 minutes from here right now, this kind of murder and violence. So what are we going to do about it? And I felt like it was a really important moment to study that text in a religious setting. And this is what happened. A lot of that. And nothing. And it was actually a formative moment for me, because I walked out of there and thought, I need to do something about this. This is not what my Torah is about. This is not what my God is about. This is not what being a human being, created in the divine image, together with all other human beings, can possibly be about. It's fundamentally not okay. And that fire that I felt then is really live for me. So I'm not shy, but I do love my people. And I want my people to come along. I want to learn with my people and to do good together. And so it's about how I care for the people of my congregation in bringing them along with me. And for me, being here in Madison at a congregation that does include many people who are further down the road than I, especially locally, I'm learning from them, and that gives me solace and inspiration and strength. So I'm very grateful for that. But I don't see it as a choice, really. I really believe this is what we're called to do. And the response has been very positive almost across the board. There are always those, including yesterday, who will say, I'm exhausted from all of this. So I need to care, and I do care. But I hear a lot more from others. We've been waiting for so many decades for this. This is so important. This is what's keeping me here.
Thank you. Reverend Butler, as you're going around the country and touring and visiting with people and hearing people's stories, I think that exhaustion is very real, and the feeling of overwhelm, and like every day there's another crisis and it's just too much. How do you help people work through that and maintain their activism? How do you maintain your activism?
That's a great question. Another thing I hear from people is that they're dealing with friends and family members and community members that are being sucked into QAnon and Christian nationalism, and they feel desperate about that. So that's even more depressing too, because it really hits home. One of the ways is to really help people reground in spiritual practice. We all need to really deepen that for moral courage, and to ground ourselves in Scripture, because Scripture really does have spiritual strategies that can help us in times like these. And it gives us moral courage to realize that we're walking in the footsteps of people who throughout the centuries wrestled with tyrants, like you were saying, and prevailed. I love that motto, and I've seen those kind of stickers and buttons about, how does it go again?
Resisting tyrants since Pharaoh.
So, and then I think the other piece of it is that solidarity and community is also a spiritual practice. And so joining with others, for me, there's been no greater joy than to join with others to fight for justice. There was a time when the Republicans in 2017 were about to gut the Affordable Care Act. That was something I had worked hard to pass, and many in the faith community had worked hard to pass, and I knew people whose lives were saved. 20 million people were going to lose access to health care. And so I decided with some other clergy that we were going to camp out in front of Mitch McConnell's door unless he listened to us and opened his door and spoke to us, which he did not. And so we did civil disobedience. And on the way to do that, I knew what might happen, and I felt sick to my stomach. I was so nervous. But then we lined up to march over to the Capitol, and I remember looking behind me and seeing suddenly that about 100 people were in line behind us, and I smiled ear to ear, and somebody caught that on camera. And I looked at that photo later, and I was like, wow, I remember feeling sick on the way. But that was the moment, that looking over my shoulder to see the solidarity of all those people with me. And then I knew we would be all right. And ultimately, of course, we defeated that effort to gut the Affordable Care Act. And it was just thousands of Americans who were coming from all over the country to resist that attack on health care. At one point, I was helping with a press conference of Black clergy, and I was standing out in the crowd, just kind of monitoring things. And first off, a young man from in town stood behind me, and I heard him listen to the press conference, and he said, "Yes, sir, we're having some worship up in here." He was so excited. And then, and the remarks of the press conference were so prophetic. And then a young man with tattoos and wearing a baseball cap, a white guy, comes up to me and he's like, hey, are y'all gonna do civil disobedience? And I was kind of wary, right? Because there are sometimes infiltrators and stuff. And I was like, well, who are you? Tell me about yourself. He's like, my brother is sick and I drove all the way from Ohio. I got arrested yesterday and I want to do it again. So that sense of solidarity is, and I'll never forget watching people from the disabled community who were really leading that fight, watching them carried out in wheelchairs, dragging oxygen tanks out the back of the Senate building, carted off to be arrested, the vulnerability that they were willing to risk for that fight. And so for me, a lot of it is solidarity, and it's also regrounding in scripture, which actually is a living word. Like, I know when I read the text now, God is speaking to me of what I should do in this moment now. So really regrounding in that to get courage for this moment and wisdom.
Thank you. So we have some questions from the congregation. Testimony has long been a tradition in Christian churches to convey to congregations the power of Christian love and God's grace. Do you ever ask members of your congregations to testify as to how they work for justice in the democracy space?
That's a beautiful idea. I really like that. I like reclaiming the idea of testifying and testimony. You know, in some ways we think of that as kind of gotten a negative connotation sometimes because of how it's been used. But one time I was in South Africa trying to help with the global AIDS pandemic, and I found a pastor in one of the shanty towns in the townships who was using testimony to help people be more open about what was happening with the AIDS crisis, because there was such a stigma around AIDS that nobody was taking the precautions, nobody knew about it, was being kept secret. And sometimes when people would say, you know, I have AIDS, or we need to have safe sex, people would be demonized, maybe even harmed for speaking out. And so they use the idea of testimony and testifying to actually spread the word and get people seeing it as a spiritual act, to talk about this important thing and to save lives, because that's what God calls us to do. And so the idea of testifying about how we protect democracy, you know, in our congregations as part of worship could be really cool.
I'm not sure we call it that.
It's not really a Jewish thing.
Sorry. I get excited about it, but no, it's not for y'all.
I would also say we could do it more. What we have done is around pride, which is a particular concern of mine. And we have invited people to share their stories of pride journeys as LGBTQ plus individuals and as people adjacent to those individuals, parents, siblings, friends. And those have been very, very powerful. I think partly because we're driving through the Wisconsin niceness that for many years in my congregation meant, of course, we're very welcoming and inclusive, and we don't really want to hear about your life. We just want to welcome you, you know. And so there's been really direct teaching, and the community has been, my community has been really warm to it, really wanting to learn. And I think what inspires people is the vulnerability of personal testimony. Another place we've done this is a group of us went to the border to witness and lend a hand. And we were in Tijuana. We're planning to go back this time to Texas. And so we did have opportunities, those of us who went, to give testimony as to what we had seen and also to educate based on what we had learned. Yeah.
Yeah, in a Jewish context, we kind of refer to it as bearing witness.
Yeah.
And bearing witness. And that's so important to us to bear witness from testimony from Holocaust survivors to people who had abortions before Roe to people who go to the border, as many of us have done, and letting people back home know this is what we saw and what we experienced and the stories we heard and the people that we met. Is this something that happens here at First Baptist?
Yeah, it does. Though I wish it would happen within the kind of confines or context of worship more often. It does sometimes, but I'd say more often than not, it is something that we we talk about outside of worship, and we talk about it outside of worship a lot. But for those personal testimonies to be shared in worship, I think is powerful, and to link that, scripture with the actual kind of living, breathing, action that's being taken to fulfill that. So yeah, it's a beautiful idea.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bonnie, may I?
Go for it.
In my context, Lutherans, we are also not testimony people that too much attention, so for you to stand up to a place and near the back row. But in our congregation, we have an open announcement time, and that's the really fun time that this happens because for me, it's not officially part of the context of the congregation. So it can be somebody who stands up and says, I'm going down to this event at the Capitol today. Just wanted you to know I'm going and if you want to come. Or remember that voting is coming up, and if you know somebody who needs to vote, talk to me because I can help that person vote. It can be a middle schooler saying, I'm doing a swim fundraiser that's against human trafficking, and if you want to support this effort, you can find me out in the narthex afterward. It could be a kid who's going on a band trip, and that could also be part of this broader work. It could be a gardening project. So just this amazing expansiveness that I think exactly is testimony, and for me is lovely because it is how these people are moving, breathing, living this, that isn't just me saying, hey folks, go and do this.
Thank you, Nick. And speaking of voting, I'm going to pause here for a commercial announcement. February 21st, we have a very important primary election. It is a nonpartisan election for our primary for the state Supreme Court. It is traditionally, historically, the lowest voter turnout election. There was an article that I read from a couple years ago that said, oh, we had a 26% turnout. It's the highest turnout since 1965. We need to come out. We need to get everybody we know to come out to vote on February 21st. There are 4 candidates for the Supreme Court, for the state Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court right now is tilted 4-3 conservative. There are 2 conservative-leaning candidates and 2 progressive-leaning candidates. And you vote for one candidate. Whichever 2 candidates get the most votes are the 2 candidates who will be on the ballot in April. And it could be that we get 2 progressive candidates. It could be that we get 2 conservative candidates. It could be that we get 1 conservative and 1 progressive candidate. But if you don't come out in February to vote, you will have no say in who you're going to be able to vote for in April. I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm telling you to vote your values. So please do that. Please come out to vote. And that is one of my answers to the next question that I'm going to direct to Reverend Butler, because this is what you spoke about on Sunday. What is the most effective resistance? And then the second part of this question is there a place for reconciliation?
What is the most effective resistance? And is there a place for reconciliation? You're thinking of the workshop on Sunday with QAnon and conspiracy theories. So we were talking on Sunday, we did a workshop on how to reach out to people who've been pulled into conspiracy theories and Christian nationalism. How do we get, what is it, reconciliation or redemption with them? And we talked about a method called CLARA. It's an acronym for nonviolent communication. The C stands for center. Center, take some deep breaths before you have difficult conversations with people who are caught up in conspiracies or hardcore, ideas that are hurting people. Then the L stands for listen. Really listen empathetically to what they're saying and repeat back what they're saying. So you're saying this, and so you're saying that, and really listen underneath to what feelings are motivating their beliefs. Then after that, you ask questions and you respond. The idea is really to get underneath at what feelings and emotions are driving, and often it's fear, anxiety, to really try to connect with them around that, and to share some of the ways in which you can connect with their fears and their anxieties. I'm also worried about healthcare, or I'm also fearful about the COVID pandemic. Can I share this with you? And so I can send it to you if you want, but we were really just talking about how to engage people and bring them compassionately into our circle, and not just kind of write them off or approach them by trying to enter into debate and trying to win points and trying to win an argument. But how do we really engage and help people understand what's at stake?
Thank you. Tim, do we have questions or comments from people online?
Yeah, I have at least one question here. Given the racist history of voucher schools and private segregationist schools, do you think the idea of private Christian schools today is moral? I haven't heard anyone discuss this, and I've been thinking about it.
Ooh, I hadn't really even thought about that either. Is it moral, is the question, to have private Christian schools? I mean, I think it might depend on how you do it. A private Christian school that made sure that people who couldn't afford, the school could come if they wanted to be educated in a particular, religious mindset and values. Hopefully it would be a progressive one, in my view, a progressive Christian school. I think the problem is the inequality, the inequity, that this is being used as a strategy to undermine public schools and to undermine education for all people. It's not that it's a Christian school, there are Jewish schools or Catholic schools, or people have an interest sometimes in having their kids educated in a religious context, but when that is a strategy for siphoning off money and depriving some people of the education that they need, then we're actually going against our religious values. So that's really what's at stake in the question.
I'd say I'm hearing an increased need to resist Christian nationalism. Reverend Butler, given the long history you share, including segregation and also Nazi Germany, would you say Christian nationalism is more of a threat demanding our response today, or that we're more responsive, or maybe more divided?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think it's as much of a threat today as it was in the era of Jim Crow segregation. And it's also becoming a threat globally because religious nationalisms globally are resurging, and also autocratic governments are resurging. And those actors are all working together. Not necessarily, but they're working together. They're funding, like Russia is funding some of the stuff that's happening here. Hindu nationalists are funding some of the politicians here. And so that is a really grave threat. And so I see kind of a cyclical thing happen. That's why I mentioned the slavery and the abolitionists that rose up and civil rights that rose up to address Jim Crow. I think we're in another turning point in history that's about as big as that. And has global implications in a new way, given that we're so globalized as a world now. So it's an important moment in history that will all rise to the occasion and turn that wheel of history. I wonder what others think, because that's a kind of deep question. It's hard to measure and weigh it exactly, right? I wonder if y'all feel that weight or not. Maybe I'm overblowing it.
I think it's a huge problem, and as big a problem as it has ever been, if not more so. And I see the problem permeating places where I wouldn't have thought it would go. The current government of Israel being an example. It's very problematic what's happening there, and among Jews, there's a situation of helping people to see what's happening, and that it isn't just that Israel's government is very confusing and there are different parties and different things and it's a very complicated place, but that there's a real problem right now, and it is part of this, even though it's certainly not Christian nationalism, it's driven by some of the same impulses, and they're not impulses that I, as a religious person, think are proper. I don't think they're what God is asking us to be about or what our sources are. I grew up in the 80s also, 70s and 80s, and I never experienced anti-Semitism. I thought it was a thing of the past, and it's a very real reality now in ways that that are more severe than during my growing up years. So yeah, this kind of nationalism not just affecting Jews, but affecting cultures worldwide. I see it moving quickly.
Yeah.
Also, so that concerns me. I think the rate of like the dominoes falling is really great, and that together with the interconnectivity of people across the globe causes me a lot of concern.
Yeah, social media.
Yeah.
Yeah, say more, each of you, about what you see as the role of social media in where we are today in our society.
Yeah, social media is like this double-edged sword, right? I mean, it's this great way to keep connected with people. I mean, I keep connected, for example, with my extended family that's all still living in Germany, and I get to see what they're up to and their photos and all of that, and that's wonderful. But that's also the platform that I routinely will get threats against me because I'm an openly gay pastor. And I think it is probably doubly upsetting to people that I'm a Baptist pastor. And so, how dare I? What was this congregation thinking? I don't know. But you know, it makes it easier, I think, also when you're hiding behind a computer screen, behind a keyboard, to bully others. Your rhetoric, I don't think you see the effects that your rhetoric has on others. It's easier, I think, for like-minded folks to find each other, to organize. I want to believe maybe there was a time when it was much harder for people to get together and, let's say, mount a full-on insurrection like January 6th. But with social media, that's so easy to gather like-minded people and coalesce around that. And so it can be a really dangerous platform for hate.
Good point.
I guess I would add, on the hate side of things, the people who are caught up in what drives them to then go out and commit a mass shooting are often very absorbed in online, I don't know what it is, but some online communities that end up causing some of these people to feel that the only thing they can now do is to go out and do this heinous thing. And I'm terrified of it, actually. I don't know what we are to do about it, especially at a time when so many people, and especially people who are reclusive and don't have many friends, are not seen. They're not coming into our houses of worship, or, you know, we don't know how to reach them. I don't know how to reach them, certainly. As a school person, I have some ideas and critiques, but that's not what I do now. So that, to me, is the very scary piece, that we are seeing it and we're not on the other side of it. We're chasing it. On a positive note, since the pandemic, many synagogues have started providing online opportunities to gather in ways that we weren't doing before. And so people are accessing learning opportunities and homily opportunities to get kind of stoked about the social justice work that's going on. And it did used to be that people more often didn't want to hear politics in the synagogue. They came there to have a safe space to, I don't know, you know, to get tranquilized, take a nap. There's some nice songs. But that isn't actually really motivating for people. We don't grow from that, and everybody knows it. And people do want to grow, and they want to be held accountable for being human, and they want to unite with other people and do good. And so people are seeing these various classes, groups, sermons, and talking about them and sharing them. And that's been really exciting.
That's great. Yeah, I think this is a good list. I'm also thinking of the algorithms that, you know, attract you to, you click on one thing and then they, on social media, they then show you more of that thing, right? And so eventually what people do is if they click on one sort of conservative thing, then it leads them to the next extreme thing, then the next extreme thing. And pretty soon the algorithm's only showing them that thing. So they're not getting balanced perspectives. And they don't have the analytical and critical skills to analyze that. And then with COVID, we were all isolated. And so a lot of people got sucked down little rabbit holes into QAnon and are now detoxing. You know, about a third of those folks came out after the insurrection failed and they started to say, wait, things aren't adding up, you know. But that is a real problem. And then the fact that anger and rage and vitriolic emotion, they're very sticky and they're very marketable. And so there's a real big financial incentive to market conspiracy theories, and people are just making money right and left off of this kind of a trade. A lot of it is about monetizing it. And so, you know, some of the things we can do, we can get Facebook to change its algorithms. Some of that has happened. Twitter for a while, you know, kicked off bad actors, which was great until Elon Musk took it over. So that's important. We can teach analytical, critical thinking skills to folks, you know, and help them understand how the internet works. I'm having to do that, you know, with family members, you know, that, you know, they just don't understand how it all works, and that it's not the same as when you used to buy a newspaper. You know, those had some bias sometimes, right? But there was at least kind of like a, you know, a little bit more oversight to it. So anybody can get on the internet and say anything, and none of it is vetted or anything. So it's there's just a lot we need to learn how to do as human beings. We have this new tool at our disposal, and it can do so many wonderful things, but we also don't know how to manage it as human beings quite yet.
So I have one more question, and then we're going to have a call to action. And I know somebody was asking about what's up on the screen and what these pieces of legislation mean. And at our call to action, which Peter is going to give, he's going to explain what these bills are and what the implications are. The last question that I have, and if there's any more online, I'm eager not to feel disheartened or threatened by not always having young faces involved, or maybe lots of numbers. Where is our strength and our vitality? What or who is necessary?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the more we speak vocally to social justice, the more young people will be attracted back into our message. And I think a colleague of mine, Tracy Blackman, who was very active in the Ferguson uprising, speaks of the church of the streets. Get out of the building and into the streets and into coffee houses and places where young people are, and try to meet them there. Young people are socially active, and they have strategies that we need, like social media strategies. And, you know, and I think the more we organize, the more the vitality will come back. I know it's hard, and I also feel that sometimes, but I feel like what we do at Faith in Public Life, to me, and this again is a very Christian word, but is sort of evangelism, which technically means spreading the good news. So holding up God's vision for abundance and human dignity is great news. We don't have to live together in fear. We can find a way that everybody can do well and have the things that they need. And so that gets me excited, and I know that God also moves among us and blesses our efforts. And so ultimately, I like to think this is in God's hands, and the more we align ourselves, I feel a simple joy in doing that. I don't know what the outcome is always, Sometimes I see a great outcome. Other times I don't know. That's the mystery of it all. But I know ultimately God blesses it.
I want to echo a little bit of what you're saying too, because in my experience, at least here, right, if I'm looking here within this congregation, I won't necessarily see a lot of those younger faces on a Sunday morning in a worship service, but they will show up to help with the pride booth. And that is a form of, like, doing justice is a form of worship for them. And so just, I think maybe changing our mindset to see the entirety of the ministries that we have and seeing how people are involved, not just counting those numbers, butts in pews on a Sunday morning in a worship service too, is just a way we might change how we evaluate how we're fulfilling our mission.
That's really good.
Absolutely. I think there's another group that in Jewish congregations is often untapped, and that is people whose children are grown and they are not yet retired. So they don't have the home responsibilities that kept them so busy when they were raising children, and they have a lot of connection, resources, professional connections, and personal connections. They're still earning money if they're working. And what happens often among Jewish families is that a family will send their children to religious school, bring them to services, and then, the kids grow up and the parents are tired, but I think also they're bored. We could talk about the many reasons why they might be bored, but I think that part of it is that they haven't grown as humans through being part of a religious community. And they see the world around them is crying out for repair, and they're not feeling that they hear the good word, as it were, but they're not feeling that they're actually living into that. And so I think that that's a group that is ripe for a lot of mobilization.
Thank you. I really want to thank our panel for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom and your experience with us. It's been really a great conversation. I really want to thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to call up Dr. Peter Bakken, Justice and Witness Coordinator for Wisconsin Council of Churches, and my partner in crimes.
Yes, thank you, Bonnie. I can't resist transitioning from the presentation and the discussion to the call to action. I have to use this quote from the beginning of J.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, where the old and wise wizard Gandalf is talking to the timid little hobbit Frodo about a great evil that is arising again in the world. And he says, always after a defeat and a respite, the shadow takes another shape and grows again. I wish it need not have happened in my time, says Frodo. So do I, says Gandalf. And so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. So this call to action gives us a concrete opportunity to take action in the time with which we are faced and with the memory of all that has gone before. And this is something that you can do both as you're here now, present in this building, or online. There are two items in front of the legislature that would seriously harm our efforts to push back against white Christian nationalism and other forms of white supremacy. And these are bills that look benign on the surface. It's very hard to argue with what they say, just kind of at face value. But there's really something going on much more concerning at deeper levels and behind these. SB 10, that's the number that the legislature assigns to a bill that is before it, is about pupil or minor access to harmful material in public libraries and public schools. And it's intended to prevent access to any image that depicts nudity, sexually explicit conduct, sadomasochistic abuse, physical torture, or brutality that is harmful to children, or any printed material that has similar content. Now, nobody wants children to be harmed or exposed to truly harmful materials, but how would this be applied? You know, would it apply to the Bible? Would it apply to Shakespeare or other literature? Art history, biology, psychology, and especially, how would it apply to the history of white supremacism? How would it apply to studies of the Holocaust and other genocides? Part of the problem is the fuzziness of this sort of a definition means that teachers and librarians are going to be uncertain, they're going to be afraid, and they're going to be tempted to censor themselves. You know, it's called preemptive compliance. You know, the hammer doesn't have to come down in order for you to duck and get out of the way. And then there are all these requirements for what schools and libraries have to do. Libraries would have to have some sort of internet filtering, procedures for restricting access. Schools would have to have a policy that specifies what are the criteria for determining whether certain material is offensive to prevailing standards and with respect to what is suitable for children. So see, we're already moving from what's harmful to what's unsuitable, to what's offensive. The line just gets getting blurrier and blurrier. And the fact that schools would also be required to make the complete curriculum and all instructional materials available for inspection by parents or guardians upon request. So what you have is this financial and administrative burden, unnecessary in my view, that's being put on libraries and schools that are already attentive to these issues. You know, what would it cost in time and materials for schools to respond to such a request? And how would they be exposed to frivolous, uninformed, or ideologically driven challenges? Like, you know, I know in one school district in Florida, there's someone who is just filing complaint after complaint after complaint after complaint against books that they haven't even read. You know, it just opens up this huge can of worms and makes what's already a difficult task for schools and libraries even more difficult, and at the cost of our children's education and our young people's access to what they need. And it's not asking, how are children harmed by not having access to certain materials? How are they harmed by not understanding the full history of our country and racism and anti-Semitism? How are they harmed by not seeing images of people like them in terms of gender identity, sexual orientation, color, in the things that they're reading and seeing in school? And this is a good time to contact legislators about that. The bill is in committee right now, which means the committee may or may not, I suppose, hold a hearing and then vote on whether it should go to the full legislature. And it doesn't have a companion bill in the assembly yet. So it's early days, and it's a good time to weigh in. And even if your legislator might be on your side on an issue like this, it's a good time to, you know, raise the awareness and let them know that you're paying attention to what's going on. And I would mention that, you know, you can use this QR code or the link that's on the screen. It's in materials that have been sent to folks that are watching online. And that will take you to the Wisconsin Council of Churches advocacy site, which will enable you to contact your legislators very easily. And then if you also click on some of the links inside the alert, it will take you to information about the bill. You can read the whole bill, you can see where it is. As time goes on, you can track its progress and so on. The second bill is Senate Joint Resolution 7 and its companion Assembly Joint Resolution 8 that was just introduced. And it would call for an advisory referendum on the April election ballot that would ask voters to endorse, to say yes or no, should schools be prohibited from providing curriculum or instruction to students that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex, or that an individual, by virtue of the individual's race or sex, bears responsibility for acts committed in the past by other individuals of the same race or sex. Now, what's important to note about this is much of the language in that referendum echoes language that was in a bill that was passed by the legislature last session. It was vetoed by the governor. That would have had a terrible chilling effect on the teaching of issues like history of racism, white supremacism, and also, you know, the continuing legacy, the notion of racism and institutional racism and how these legacies live on. You know, of course we don't want anyone to be taught that one race is superior to another, but how is teaching interpreted can be twisted in talking about things like implicit bias or white privilege that could be twisted into seeing it as setting up that kind of a you know, racist ideology in reverse. You know, that and why do we even think that that's something that we need to address right now? I mean, it's sort of an accusation, you know, an implicit accusation. It's not, in this case, coming out and saying it, but it's implying that this is what's happening in our schools. And it's confusing the idea of an individual sense, I am responsible for something this person or these persons did, with our collective responsibility to deal with the effects of past actions that have been done in our name from which we benefit and from which other people suffer. Now, joint resolutions can't be vetoed. They won't change, and the advisory referendum, even if it passes, won't change any laws, but it will reinforce these sorts of misunderstandings about what's being taught in our school, what equity and inclusive education is all about. It won't solve real problems, but it'll provide talking points. And it will also drive people, and it's also intended to drive people, especially people with certain opinions, to the polling booth in April, and we also know what's at stake in that election. So there's this sort of agenda behind it. And I think that by raising this issue in people's minds, it's going to pave the way for the sort of legislation we saw last session to come up again, and then have to have that fight all over again. The last thing, there's also the QR code and the bit.ly link in your program and on the online materials that will take you to, taking a faithful stand for equity. So if you click on that, if you sign up, take the pledge to stand up for equity in your community, to be an active, civically active participant on behalf of equity in your community, in your school district. That'll get you the opportunity to sign that. You'll be on the mailing list so that you'll get the invitations to the meetings that we have every month for education and organizing about this and all the things that Bonnie talked about at the beginning of this event tonight. And so I invite you, I mean, this is the time in which we are, and we have to take action now. Yes, you have a question? Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. It's an additional burden. Yeah, and yeah, it is not intended to help teach. So, to put it bluntly. So, thank you. I think somebody else is going to be in charge of closing us out. That wasn't what I signed up for.
Thank you, Peter. So thank you all for being here tonight. I know that sometimes we get very overwhelmed and there's just so much coming at us all the time, and there's such a just an influx of information constantly coming at us. And so I just want to leave you with this, my favorite quote from the Talmud, from Jewish tradition. Rabbi Tarfon 2,000 years ago taught us, it's not incumbent upon you to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. So keep that in mind. It's not all on you, but do your part. If all of us do what we can do, we really can change things. So thank you all so much. Please join us outside for some refreshments. Reverend Butler will be selling and signing her book, and we can continue our conversation. Thank you all.